Fight, men! The throne of Lilith awaits you! Sender and Zalkin came up next to Xander, whose hands were on his hips as he gazed over the men. Smiling, he continued to bark out cheers and goad on the men. Sender turned to him and smirked. This feels more like a bar fight than a landing. Xander chuckled. Empress, when it comes to electing the king, I'm not sure there's much difference. They shared a laugh, and Zalkin forced one out as well. There were now only 3 men on the statue itself, and the platoons were broken into about 6 different clusters, cheering and screaming as if mad. Zalkin could swear she saw coinage being exchanged between hands as well. Gambling, prohibited by the state and the religion, but given a blind eye when it came to landing quests. This was the bombastic party the men longed for, the spoils of rewards, and the promotion of one of their own. It stood as a test of hope, Xander always argued, that any man could achieve the Noxish crown from even the most barren of peasantry. It also served as a great recruitment tool, which is what Sender favored in its pragmatism, to get bodies in the armies. However, the companies chosen for the landing quests were always hand-picked by the Empress herself, so it was never truly an equal chance to become king of a prefecture. This was compounded by the fact that there was an unspoken rule that captains and cadets had priority on becoming kings through landings, so it came as no surprise that 3 men were basically handed the chance to fight for it. The 3 men, clad in medium armor, were crawling over the statue. 2 men standing on Indacnius' arms, one on his leg clasping onto the stone tunic. They were all punching at the head with the butts of their epaulettes, chipping away gradually and adding rivets and kinks into the monument. It was like a tree's bark being chipped away with rusty axes. That's Tomalsh, Xander explained as he pointed at the burly man on the statue's right arm. I think he's got the brute strength to rip the head off first. And the other 2? Sender inquired. Throwan and Uton. I don't expect much of a chance out of them. Don't get me wrong, they are excellent commanders and captains, but are just outclassed by Tomalsh's pure ability. It's really just a formality that they are still fighting. Zalkin could not help herself but let out a chuckle. Even in such a barbaric and unruly custom like this, there still managed to be rules, regulations, and protocols that were bounded to. Could there ever be an escape from bureaucracy? Edging towards a power-aspected king for this region, I see. Zalkin's words have changed the topic from where her mind had wandered. It was a habit of hers to return to the doctrine in times of too much rumination. You've been reading more about the great balancing of domination, haven't you? Thank you for noticing, Priest Zalkin. Nilib's interpretation has been working thus far. The true interpretation, Sender cut in. Yes, of course, Empress. And, well, Talum had a leaning for the cunning in its former aspect. Tomalsh knows his power-hardened being will be necessary for the prefecture. Lilith, Xander. This time Zalkin cut in. Pardon me, Zalkin. I even said it earlier, it's just so much strategizing of this takeover, I did not expect the landing to run so smoothly. Old habits. Xander was tasked with studying the area of Lilith when it was still under the Taluman rule of Indacnius. While his demeanor was forward and brash, and he could come off as an everyman in most circumstances, he had a strange propensity to absorb doctrine and study tactics like scholars of previous ages. Zalkin had commended him for that. But of course, he still made the sacrilegious quip or misinterpretation from time to time. But regardless, I knew today's landing would work out. Our men prayed the landing hymn over the entire march before you 2 convened with us, and of course I spoke with Tomalsh privately before. Reverberations could be felt off the walls as the wailing and cheering of the men continued to grow. Likely their drunkenness was growing as well. Upon closer examination, Zalkin could tell that the other 2 men on the statue, whose names she had already forgotten, were not really even stabbing or clubbing at the statue. They were pressing their epaulettes against the neck, but there was no serious pressure being applied. It was like everyone was in on the secret, but everyone went along with it simultaneously. But this is the way it is meant to be. Today was a landing to be rejoiced. Tomasz finally sequestered the head off of the statue. It popped off and rolled along the floor, where he jumped after it and snatched it up, hoisting it against the storm of the crowd's roars. He and the rest of the company turned to face the three elites upon the second level, peering below to them. Xander maintained a serious composure. "Kneel!" he yelled across the building, and all the men in their rambling managed to find enough stillness to bend down. "Tomasz Fernix of the 3rd Prefecture Prenderis, rise before your company." He stood holding the head and turned around again, facing the men who had just exalted him. There were sparkles in the eyes of so many who looked upon him. This was the religion coming into fruition. It was not just the legends and the divinities and the magic of the gods itself, but the ceremonies and the conquest, the bloodshed and the honor. These were the values that kept the Noxish tied to the 23. "Come before the Empress and accept your fate," Xander yelled again, and this time the crowd could not contain themselves as Tomasz walked over towards the steps. He climbed up, beaming as the men cheered him on with such gusto and pride. This had been the most incredible day of his life. There was, of course, pride in Sender as well. This was her empire fulfilling the Noxish promise, one king at a time. "Tomasz?" Sender now alternated spots with Xander, standing in the head. Tomasz appropriately knelt before her. "Trade with me the blood spilled today of a people vanquished for the 23 aspects." Tomasz extended out the head of the statue. Sender grabbed it in an instant and threw it down before her with a signet-infused throw. This was the first display today to the soldiers of the priestly magic the Noxish elites possessed, a brief sampling of the power that could be obtained through a royal bloodline. The reverence in the crowd was briefly abandoned for wonder in a collection of gasps before Sender rose her hand to quiet the audience. Zalkin then stepped forward to take up her brief role. "The old have fallen. The false have been annulled. The promise is restored. The hope is undying. Tomasz of the 3rd, become the 17th king of the world." The crowd cheered for miles. "You are king of Lilith. Rise!" And as King Tomasz stood before Empress Sender, her hand grasping Indakna's forgotten blade, gripped more tightly. She closed her eyes and the 23 hues sparkled from her plate. A brilliant glowing rainbow hovered over her and somehow poured as if it were a liquid into the sword itself, shining a luster brighter than the sun, extending over the great crowd, blinding them in a moment. With that, the artifacts of the Empress, priest, and General Xander all glowed with light. Finally, in that moment, she had somehow forged the sword into an epaulettes, and handed the former Tolumin sword, now Lilithian epaulettes, which glowed with Noxish brilliance, over to the new king. Tears rolled down his eyes in reverence as he held the epaulettes in both hands. He crossed it with the Empress, as was tradition, and rubbed the blade alongside hers. The lances buzzed like hornets. The blades bloomed with sunlight. The four stood in earnest, and the company was belting out exultation after exultation. It was time. With a yell of the 23, Empress Sender pulled from the hilt of her epaulettes and swung, cutting clean off the head of the new king. Using aspects, she extended her hands out and fused the freshly cut head with particles of Lilith, the dust, the air, the granite, and soil beneath soil beneath soil, which held the original bedrock of foundation prior to the false rule of Indaknius. Another glowing poured through the building, through the city, and out into the distant farmlands, filming them with radiance. Again, When the light boomeranged back, it formed back into Tamalsh, whose body was re-energized, head as if untouched, holding an expression of solace and respect. He had ascended. He had been rebirthed into the Noxish divinity. His armor now had minor hues of the 23. His face glowed, and a crown of the 17th, life and humanity, granite and lattices, adorned his head. Aspect of power, 17th signet of life and humanity, benevolence upon the world through Lilith and its king. Tamalsh, with a scar over his neck, but more power than he had ever felt in his life, walked forward. He extended his sword and spoke for the first time as king, remembering that one line Jonder had him memorize. Lilith under me, and the world under Nox. King am I now. And the crowd cheered for miles. The glowing faded into a warm hum, which would last for the next week. The army and men cheered, and Sender and the others applauded as well. Today was a celebration, and feasts were on their way for that evening. But something was amiss. Something that Tamalsh could not know, and Sender had glanced over. It was something that Zalkin would not learn of for years, until the priests had reinterpreted today's canonization. It was that cursed mask, still somewhere. It watched, and Nox was doomed. It was doomed to no longer exist. Matahatic hungered. An Empty Kingdom, Part 2.